Did this war only fight with cannons and trenches? This war was not won with bayonets and barbed wire. World War I was also an economic war. A war fought in gold reserves, in bond markets, in central banks, and in the secret offices of financiers, who had never set foot on a battlefield. While soldiers paid with their lives, bankers and governments were calculating balance sheets, and what they did in those years did not only determine who would win and who would lose, it rewired the global financial system in ways that are still trapping you today. If you think war is only about politics and armies, think again. World War I proved that money is a very powerful weapon. One of the most dangerous ever invented. In 1914, Europe was already a powder keg, ready to ignite at a single spark. National rivalries, colonial ambitions, and military alliances had turned the continent into a chessboard. But beneath all the speeches about honor and empire, an economic reality lay waiting. A war of this magnitude could not be sustained without unimaginable sums of money. And here is the critical point. When leaders chose to go to war, they were simultaneously choosing debt. Every empire driving soldiers onto the battlefield was also driving its people toward a future filled with economic crisis and poverty. But at the start of this war, most governments believed it would end quickly. Maybe by the new year, they said. They thought they could finance it with gold, with limited borrowing, with patriotic donations. Within weeks, that illusion disappeared. The war was consuming money in ways they could not even have predicted. In the summer of 1914, Europe's financial system still rested on the gold standard. Countries promised that their paper money could be exchanged for actual gold. This system gave currencies credibility but also tied the hands of governments. Gold reserves were limited. You could not print as much as you wanted without losing the trust of your people and your creditors. Britain, France, and Germany all had valuable reserves. But once millions of people were mobilized and industry redirected to weapons, cost instantly soared. Germany was spending over 10 million marks per day by late 1914. Britain's war costs would soon reach £2.5 million every single day. The math was merciless. The gold would not last. So, governments suspended the rules. One by one, the major powers abandoned the gold standard, quietly admitting to their citizens that money was now essentially a promise, backed by nothing more than faith in the state. In that moment, the breaking of the gold anchor was one of the most important financial shifts in modern history. It showed how unreliable and fragile the so-called real wealth of nations actually was. Money and power were no longer tied to metal. They were driven by printing presses, credit, and persuasion. And once governments realized this freedom, they never went back. The economic war now began in earnest. For Germany, cut off from global capital markets and encircled by the Royal Navy's blockade, the only option was domestic borrowing. Berlin launched massive bond drives appealing to patriotism, urging ordinary citizens to pour their savings into war loans. The propaganda was relentless. Posters of heroic soldiers, calls for families to sacrifice their luxuries for the fatherland, constant promises that the ordinary people who had given everything they had would be repaid after victory. Germany raised over 100 billion marks this way, but it was a pyramid built on hope. When Germany lost the war, those bonds were worthless. Millions of Germans watched their life savings wiped out. And that bitterness became fertile ground in which extremism would take root in the decades that followed. Britain, by contrast, had one immense advantage. London was the financial hub of the world. Sterling was trusted and British networks spread across the globe. At first, the government leaned on short-term borrowing, treasury bills, and patriotic appeals, but very soon it tapped into the deeper pools of global credit, and as a critical move, it turned to the United States. In 1914, America was officially neutral, but American banks had smelled opportunity. Firms like J.P. Morgan and Company became the financial lifeline of Britain and France. They arranged vast loans. They managed purchases of weapons, food, and raw materials. By 1917, when America itself entered the war, Wall Street had already been bankrolling the Allied cause for years. This was not charity, this was power. American bankers earned millions in fees, and the United States emerged from the war transformed, from debtor to creditor, from a financial follower to a global leader. If you wonder how the 20th century became the American century, here is where it begins. France faced its own dilemmas. Already weakened by the costs of building its defenses and scarred by the Franco-Prussian War, France leaned even more heavily on both domestic and international credit. French citizens, long known as eager savers, were persuaded to buy government bonds. But much of the deeper funding again came from across the Atlantic. France, like Britain, became increasingly dependent on American capital, and this dependency would shape politics after the war, when debts loomed and repayment became a source of deep tension. When you hear about the interwar economic crisis, remember that it was not just about reparations or stock markets. It was also about the crushing weight of debt accumulated during those 4 years of war. Russia's economic war was an outright disaster. The empire was vast but had fallen behind other nations in its development. Its banking system was fragile, its gold reserves were impressive on paper, but insufficient in practice. To finance its war effort, Russia borrowed heavily from its allies, particularly France. But as defeats piled up without end and inflation soared, faith in the ruble collapsed. By 1917, the Russian economy was in ruins, and the political system went with it. The collapse of the Tsarist regime was not just about ideology or bad generals. It was about poor financial decisions that had stretched the system past its breaking point. Economic mistakes, monetary chaos, and inflation fueled the revolution further. Once again, money and power marched together into history. The scale of the financial mistakes was staggering. By the end of the war, the Allied powers had spent more than $140 billion. The Central Powers had spent around $60 billion. These were sums the world had never seen before, equal to many times the total pre-war national incomes of the combatants. The result was not only mountains of debt, it was the destruction of the old financial order. The gold standard, once the foundation of global trust, was shattered. Inflation tore through economies. Germany would soon face hyperinflation so extreme that a loaf of bread cost billions of marks, and ordinary people, workers, savers, small investors, were the ones who paid. The wealthy elites, meanwhile, often protected themselves by shifting assets abroad, by buying real goods, by staying close to the centers of power where information leaked first. The lesson was brutal, but clear. In a financial war, the small saver bleeds first. And here is the connection that matters for you today. World War I was the moment when governments learned they could finance the unimaginable by detaching money from reality. They discovered that they could suspend gold, print endlessly, issue bonds to their own citizens, borrow across borders, and then patch the ruins later with propaganda and restructuring, because the playbook has never disappeared. Every modern crisis, from the Great Depression to the global financial crash of 2008, carries echoes of 1914. When governments or central banks insist that this is temporary or that the fundamentals are sound, remember that in 1914 they were saying the same things. And millions of people believed them, right up until the money in their hands was worthless. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world looked like a battlefield, not just in trenches but in balance sheets. The United States, which had been a debtor nation before the war, now held the world's largest gold reserves and the largest creditor position in history. Europe, the old heart of global finance, was drowning in debt. Britain owed America over $4 billion. France owed more than $3 billion. Even smaller nations were entangled in obligations they could never realistically repay. The war had turned Wall Street into the new financial capital of the planet, displacing London in a way no cannon could have achieved. The age of American dominance in money and power had begun. But this was not a smooth transition, because here is where the trap came from. When wars are funded by borrowing, repayment becomes its own war. Britain and France, desperate to keep faith with citizens who had bought war bonds, now had to squeeze money out of Germany in the form of reparations. The Treaty of Versailles demanded an astronomical sum, 132 billion gold marks. It was meant to punish, to cripple, and to shift the burden onto the defeated. But it was also a fantasy. Germany simply could not pay. Every attempt to do so, whether through printing money or transferring goods, destabilized its economy further. The hyperinflation of 1923, when Germans carted wheelbarrows of worthless notes just to buy bread, was not an accident. It was the direct consequence of a financial system pushed to the edge by impossible debts, and it planted seeds of rage that extremists would later harvest. Britain, meanwhile, was trying to restore its financial prestige by returning to the gold standard in 1925, pegging the pound at its old pre-war value. But this was another economic mistake of staggering proportions. The British economy had been devastated, its industrial base weakened, its debts towering. Restoring the pound at its old parity was like forcing a broken limb back into place without healing it first. The result was deflation, unemployment, and unrest. The policy, championed by figures like Winston Churchill, is now remembered as one of the worst financial miscalculations in modern economic history. And again, ordinary workers paid the price while elites clung to the illusion of restored greatness. America, flush with gold and credit, faced a different challenge: what to do with its new dominance. American banks began pouring money back into Europe, lending to Germany so that Germany could pay reparations to Britain and France, who could then pay back their debts to America. It was a financial merry-go-round that looked stable on the surface but was built on circular logic. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 institutionalized this flow. Money was being recycled, not created, and when the global economy shuddered in the Great Depression, the entire structure collapsed. The world had never been more financially interlinked, and never more fragile. This is why World War I is not just another chapter in military history. It was a turning point in economic history. It showed that governments could abandon gold, inflate currencies, and borrow on an unprecedented scale, and yet still persuade their citizens that they were doing the right thing. It proved that debt could be dressed as patriotism, that ordinary savers could be convinced to hand over their wealth for bonds that would never be repaid, and that the real winners of war were often those who sat in boardrooms, not those who fought in trenches. Money and power were fused tighter than ever, and the world has lived with the consequences ever since. Now think about your life today, when central banks promise that inflation is temporary, when governments expand debt ceilings year after year, when new money is conjured digitally at the stroke of a key. Remember 1914. Remember that the gold standard was not abandoned by accident, but by design, in a moment of desperation. Remember that the pattern of borrowing against the future, of printing to cover the present, of selling bonds with patriotic slogans, is more than a century old. Every financial crisis of the modern era has roots in those war years, from the stagflation of the 1970s to the subprime collapse of 2008. The same illusions are still at work, and the same people, the ordinary saver, the middle-class worker, the small investor, are still the ones asked to sacrifice. The hidden financial battle behind World War I is not a relic of the past. It is the foundation of the present. The lesson is harsh but necessary. Money, once untethered from reality, becomes a tool of manipulation. Governments will always find ways to finance wars, to finance bailouts, to finance crises, and they will always find ways to make you pay for it, whether through taxes, inflation, or the erosion of your savings. Real wealth is not just numbers on a screen or promises from politicians. Real wealth is resilience, knowledge, and the ability to see through illusions. That is the only financial freedom history allows. And here is the final thought to leave with you. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. The financial playbook written in 1914 has been used again and again, dressed in new language, presented with new justifications. But the outcome is always the same. Those in power protect themselves. Those without knowledge are sacrificed. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Never assume money is real just because it is printed. Never assume the system is stable just because the authorities say so. The truth is always hidden in the balance sheets, and history is the only teacher that does not lie. If you are curious about the dark and unlit corners of history that powerful forces have long tried to keep hidden, do not forget to subscribe.